Canada just turned a problem into a big win, while the United States is feeling the pain. The cheap oil America counted on is no longer easy to get, and now buyers from across the world are fighting for the same supply. Canada is gaining power fast, but what changed so suddenly has left many shocked. For most of the past decade, Western Canadian Select, the benchmark price for Alberta's heavy oil sands crude, traded at discounts to West Texas Intermediate that routinely reached $20, $25, and at various points, $40 per barrel below the American benchmark. In early 2026, that discount narrowed to approximately $12 to $15 per barrel as the Trans Mountain expansion delivered its first full year of Pacific Coast export capacity. Then the Iran conflict disrupted Strait of Hormuz shipping, and WCS moved in a way that would have been impossible before May 2024. The price of Western Canadian Select surged toward levels that closed roughly 80% of the historic discount in a matter of weeks. American refineries that had been purchasing Canadian heavy crude at steep discounts for 40 years suddenly found themselves competing with Asian buyers for the same barrels and paying for it. The Trans Mountain expansion is the structural change that made the 2026 price movement possible. Before May 2024, Canada's export pipeline capacity to Tidewater was effectively zero for crude oil beyond the existing limited Trans Mountain pipeline. Nearly all Alberta production moved south into the American market through the Enbridge Mainline and other pipeline systems, arriving at Midwest and Gulf Coast refineries with no alternative buyer competition to support prices. The TMX expansion increased Trans Mountain pipeline system throughput from approximately 294,000 barrels per day before the expansion to an average of 847,000 barrels per day in the fourth quarter of 2024, an increase of 553,000 barrels per day reaching Pacific Tidewater. Those barrels no longer had to be sold at whatever American refineries were willing to pay. They could be loaded onto tankers at Westridge Marine Terminal in Burnaby and shipped directly to Chinese, South Korean, Japanese, and Indian refineries bidding for the same supply. Tanker liftings from Westridge increased from roughly 5 per month before the expansion to approximately 35 per month in the months following full commercial service commencement. 35 tankers loading Canadian crude every month for Asian buyers is what made the WCS-WTI differential move. American refineries had previously been the only serious buyers for Alberta heavy crude at scale. They now face competition from buyers in 4 countries across the Pacific, all of whom need reliable heavy crude supply, and all of whom are willing to pay prices that reflect global market conditions rather than North American pipeline-constrained discounts. Trans Mountain launched a formal open season process in March 2026, a bidding process allowing oil producers and shippers to commit to long-term transportation contracts for capacity on the expanded system. The open season is designed to convert the spot market utilization that has characterized TMX's first operating months into a contract book of long-term commitments that can support further capacity optimization, potentially justify a physical capacity expansion beyond the current 890,000 barrel per day nominal throughput. Reuters reported that Trans Mountain was seeking additional shipper support as Western Canadian egress conditions tightened, reflecting that available export capacity was increasingly constrained relative to growing Alberta production volumes. A pipeline that was sold to the public partly on the argument that it would provide sufficient egress for a generation of Alberta production is approaching its own capacity ceiling within 2 years of entering service. The Iran conflict's impact on Canadian oil markets extended beyond the direct price effect. The Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis analyzed the potential implications of the Iran conflict for Canada's fossil fuel sector and found that Middle Eastern supply disruption creates conditions specifically favorable for Canadian heavy crude because the replacement barrel for Iranian and other Gulf heavy crude grades must come from a politically stable producer with available export capacity, and Canada meets both criteria in a way that few comparable volume producers can match. Venezuelan heavy crude remains constrained by sanctions and production declines. Russian Urals are subject to G7 price caps and shipping restrictions. Mexico's Isthmus grade is declining. The list of alternative heavy crude sources that American Gulf Coast refineries can realistically access at scale when Middle Eastern supply is disrupted is short, and Canada's position on that list strengthened materially when TMX created a competitive market for its crude. The IEEFA analysis specifically noted that the Iran conflict's impact on Canadian energy revenues would depend on whether the supply disruption persisted long enough to generate sustained price premiums versus a short-term spike. The 80% price increase in WCS described in the summary is a peak of disruption figure that may not reflect the sustained average for the year. But the structural point the disruption illustrated is not price level dependent. Canada now has Pacific export capacity that prevents American buyers from setting the marginal price of Alberta heavy crude unilaterally. Even if the Iran disruption eases and WCS returns to a wider discount to WTI, that discount will be set by global market competition rather than by North American pipeline constraint alone. Gulf Coast refineries that process heavy crude, the USGC heavy crude configured refineries that have been purchasing Alberta production for decades, face the most direct consequence of the changed market structure. These facilities were built with specific coker units, hydrotreaters, and distillation configurations designed to maximize yields from high sulfur, high density crude exactly like Western Canadian Select. Reconfiguring a heavy crude refinery to process lighter crude grades requires capital expenditure in the hundreds of millions of dollars and operational downtime that reduces throughput. The refineries cannot simply switch feedstocks when Canadian crude becomes more expensive. They must either compete in the Asian bid market for Canadian barrels or accept the margin compression of paying higher feedstock prices into their existing configurations. Alberta's planned West Coast oil pipeline, for which a national interest designation is targeted by October 1st, 2026, following the Carney-Smith implementation agreement, would add 1 million barrels per day of Pacific export capacity on top of the 890,000 barrels per day TMX provides. If constructed on the timeline the implementation agreement envisions with a September 2027 construction, start representing the best case scenario, the combined Trans Mountain plus new pipeline export capacity would exceed 1.89 million barrels per day from Alberta to Pacific Tidewater. Alberta's total current production is approximately 3.8 million barrels per day. Combined TMX plus new pipeline capacity reaching 1.89 million barrels per day would give Pacific export routes access to half of Alberta's production permanently, eliminating the condition of near total American market dependence that allowed WCS to trade at structural discounts for 40 years. The Asia-Pacific Foundation documented that China received the largest single-country share of TMX-enabled tanker shipments in the second half of 2024, establishing a documented recurring procurement relationship between Chinese refiners and Canadian crude suppliers that did not exist at commercial scale before the expansion entered service. Japan, South Korea, India, and other Asia-Pacific buyers collectively absorbed the remainder of Pacific export volumes not going to China or American West Coast refineries. These are buyers who, unlike American refineries, have no legacy feedstock configuration that forces them to purchase Canadian crude. Specifically, they chose it because the price, reliability, and quality met their requirements. Their continued participation in the market for Canadian crude is what prevents any single buyer, including the United States, from setting the marginal price unilaterally.